Cynthia, hi. Thank you so much for being with me this afternoon. I can't wait to dive into our conversation about mindfulness and art. You really specialize. And what I love about this work too, Cynthia, on a side note, there's something for everyone within this world of yoga and mindfulness. And I love how you've niched down within art and nature. So I'm excited to have this conversation. So to begin, I'd love for you to share with our community here, what's your background? How did you come to be a mindfulness and art expert? What's your passion and how you bring in the creative aspects? And your
Yeah,
business is called Mindful Creative Muse, right?
it is. Yeah, thank you so much for having me today. I'll start by saying that I think my relationship to both mindfulness and art, as well as yoga, was always a very personal one. So I
Mm,
ended up coming to the practices at different times in my life, really through struggle, through having night terrors as a kid, through
mm,
being treated for cancer, through car accidents and chronic pain, or struggling with anxiety. And I say that simply to share that for me, mindfulness, meditation, art, and yoga was very oftentimes a place of a safe refuge for me. It was a place I came back to feel more comfortable in my body with my breath, coming back to the present moment. And because I had noticed for myself just how healing and supportive it was, I ended up, after many years, feeling a really deep calling to sharing this work with other people. So, fast forward, I earned my MFA, and not exaggerating, about 20 different certifications in mindfulness, meditation, expressive arts, yoga. And now I do have my business, Mindful Creative Muse. I've been running that for about 7 years online and in person, and have trained a couple thousand people in 50 countries or more. And we have 4 internationally accredited teacher trainings. And I share that not to share as like a brag thing about me, but more so really to name. I think that this there's a really strong need right now for practices that are supportive for our self-care, whether you're an adult, a parent, teacher, or you're sharing with kiddos. And I love that you mentioned as we started how accessible it is, that it really
yeah.
can meet everybody exactly where they are. So I'm excited to talk more about it.
My goodness, that's amazing. I had no idea the breadth of the work that you're doing. That's incredible. And I do love you have to say where it's come from, right? Your true heart, your true nature, and you had that calling. And I think that, I appreciate that you said you have your own personal experiences and you can empathize. It really brings another level of empathy with children, understanding where they're coming from, and by being vulnerable to say, here's what happened to me and here's how it helped me, opens up, gives them permission to feel the feelings that they're feeling and to know that whatever potentially adverse situations or conditions that they're under, they say, oh, here's a grown up who also had some tough stuff go on in their life. And look, they use these tools as a way to get where they are now, right? And looking at this combination of art and mindfulness, meditation, yoga, what are you seeing when you're practicing with children? What are the benefits that you are really seeing? And sort of like how and why now?
Yeah, I love that question. I feel like kiddos are amazing. Kiddos are they're truth tellers, they're very direct, and there is this childlike wonder naturally in them, this playfulness. They're so curious, and it's something that I love those aspects that are innate in children, and how art as a creative practice helps encourage kiddos to step into what they already naturally are wanting to explore. So they're wanting to be creative and curious. And so, what I've noticed with sharing mindfulness and art with kids, or with parents and teachers who share with kids, are a few different things. And research supports this as well, that we notice that it can help increase focus. It can definitely help with self regulation. It can help to spark more creativity. A big part about one of the like main foundations of mindful art that I like to name is that the focus is on combining mindfulness and art, which mindfulness is simply just coming back to the present moment. And the key part is with as much non judgment as possible. And so, especially for our kiddos, to have exercises that are very simple that already encourages what they're wanting to play and explore, but doing it in a way that's very kind and patient and gives a lot of permission and is non-judgmental is huge. And Brene Brown, who I absolutely love, she talks about how so many adults have had moments when their children around their creativity where they had moments of feeling judged or shamed. It's, I forget the percentage now, but it's a very high percentage.
Yeah.
And so what better way to encourage our children to explore play and creativity than to have these really simple methods that they can combine into time when they're out in nature, or if they're doing finger painting, or if they're drawing or painting, these activities they're already doing, but it's just holding it in a container that is
Mm.
really kind and patient. Mhm.
Excellent. Can you dive a little bit deeper for our listeners of, okay, so people are thinking, okay, great, you've got an MFA, you've got, they can understand finger painting art experiences. They can understand, okay, mindfulness, some basic things like mindful eating or listening to sounds around you. Or can you give us a look into what are some specific, how are you bringing both of those things together?
So it can really vary depending on the age of the children. So as an example, one of the teacher trainings that we have supports parents and teachers who are working with ages preschool all the way up to high school. So you can imagine that if we're working with a 6-year-old, that might look very different than if we're working with a 16-year-old. A
Right.
lot of times as we move up in age, we also are focusing not only on tangible things with their hands or sensations, but also diving deeper into thoughts and emotions. So, some practices that I love that are very simple, that are oftentimes go tos with kiddos, is combining the breath with movement. And so as an example, I have practices that I've called breath doodles because it's very simple, just combining the breath with really simple drawing and doodles, as well as that mindful awareness. So for kids, it might be that we're encouraging them to trace their hand with a crayon or colored pencil on the page. And as they're moving and tracing up their thumb, they're inhaling. As they're moving, tracing down their thumb, they're exhaling. So syncing the movement with their breath. Sometimes we're combining movement with music or sound. There's some fun practices where, those small stand up easels that kiddos can have and play with, that they're drawing on the easel, but you have music, and the encouragement or invitation is that they're making marks that match the music and the sounds. So a lot of the mindful art activities is a combination of creating with art, but also sensory play. So noticing what are they
Mm.
hearing, what are they tactile feeling in their hands, especially if they're holding a big crayon or marker, noticing that, what colors are they using, what are they visually seeing, how are they noticing, if they're standing or if their feet are on the ground. So
Right.
it's very similar to actually if you were to do a meditation practice as an adult and you're seated with eyes closed and you're scanning through your
Yes.
body, but it's much more accessible. And I mentioned earlier that part of how I discovered some of this work was from night terrors as a child. I had night terrors when I was
Mm.
8 or 9, which is really common for kiddos. And I started doing a progressive body scan meditation that my dad had given me. And I had no idea I was meditating. I just knew I was tensing my muscles and my feet and relaxing them, and then my calves and relaxing them. And it was helping me go to sleep. And so there's these fun activities. We're just sharing activities with our kiddos and also inviting this curiosity of noticing the different senses. And then I don't know about you, Gazelle, but when I was in art class when I was younger, I
Yeah.
also remember feeling this internal pressure, like I needed to make it look like however the teacher was making it look, especially this drawing class I was in. So there's
Yeah.
also a lot of encouragement around creating whatever it is that you're creating as an adult or a child, that you don't need it to look
Mm.
like the teachers, that it doesn't have to turn out a particular way. So it is
Mm.
kind of moving away from, the grade A mentality and focusing more on our experience. And we have people that are including this in classrooms, but also in yoga studios, in meditation classes, and art classes. So I'll pause because that was a very long
Yeah,
answer,
yeah,
but there's
yeah. No,
lots
I
of
love
different
that.
ways.
Yeah, I love that. And here's the thing though, Cynthia, which is so magic is that when you're talking about it, I'm sure listeners can feel this too, is that there's they're already doing these experiences, especially with young children, right? We're already in art experiences. We already have art class, coloring, listening, all of that. So it's not like they need to add anything more, right? It's not, because that's always the thing, right? Isn't it that I can't practice yoga mindfulness. I can't add anything more to the plate. But all that you're inviting people to do, the invitation is to take that layer of intention, right? That's all it is. So you're already doing the experiences, but could you ask some questions that are sensory based? Could you have the children, besides just coloring or whatever, could you ask them some reflective questionings, or could you alter what you're already doing to maybe think, oh, how could I make this more accessible or have that extra layer, right? It's not like it's a whole new thing.
Yeah, I love that you're mentioning this because I think a couple of things. One, children automatically very often drop into a state of mindfulness and play and curiosity when they're creating art or when they're out in nature. We experience that as adults as well. I think
Yeah.
the key part, a couple parts that you're mentioning, is having the mindfulness as a foundation, an intentional foundation, and having for parents and teachers, keeping it simple, but also having some knowledge and skill around the principles of mindfulness, how to integrate that into the exercises, how to guide kiddos in a way that is appropriate for their age, their skill level. And in our teacher training, we have it as a trauma informed approach as well. So I think that there's multi layers to it. What I usually recommend is that if parents or teachers are wanting to get started for their own personal practice, or they want to possibly share with kiddos in their lives, is to have a solid foundation of a handful of different exercises that they can experiment with on their own. I have a free workbook that includes maybe 5 or 6 different exercises that will walk you through for yourself and sharing with kiddos. So I'm happy to share that. You can also find other details and information online. I think to your point, you can also just kind of frame it around that. If you're having dinner with your kiddos, you can also frame and ask questions, even just about their day, that is more mindful as well. So I think there's so many various layers. Like when I walk through doorways, I take a breath through a doorway, or if I'm sitting at a
Mm,
stoplight, I take 3 breaths at the stoplight. So there's
yeah.
so many ways we can infuse more mindful awareness in our day, and when we're sharing with children, and especially around art, that doesn't need to be really complicated, as you're
Yeah.
mentioning. Yeah.
Exactly. Okay, so let's dive a little deeper then. What would you say are sort of your three top tips where, with all the training you've been doing, what have you noticed to make mindfulness-based art super successful for the children and the grown-ups?
Yeah. So the first tip I would say is to keep it very simple, to start with what you have as far as the materials. So if you don't have any materials, you can go to the dollar store and get crayons or colored pencils or, a journal. But I like to think of removing barriers to entry, removing what's going to stop us from even like starting. And so keeping it very simple with materials, crayons, markers, watercolors, depending if it's slightly older ages or for adults. And again, to focus on, we're just going to focus on play and on the
Mm,
process and giving that permission. And then the other tip I would say is pairing it with the breath. And so I mentioned the kind of 20 different exercises with shapes, but you can also keep it really simple. And it might just be with each breath that you or the kiddo is taking that you choose to make a different mark. It's basically a visual tracing of your felt experience. And it's
mm,
often called externalization. We're visually seeing our experience out on the page from us, which can help us to be more with what's happening in the moment. And it's fun. It's fun to see what's happening. So you can pair it with the breath just by making a new mark with each breath, or as I mentioned earlier, inhaling, moving the pen upward, exhaling, moving the pen downward is a really simple one as well. Um, and then the other thing that I would just say is, as a last tip, is to keep the idea of experimentation, the permission of focusing on play, but also that it's an experiment. And you can, I mentioned nature earlier, especially if you're a parent and you're out walking with your kiddo. it can be really fun to pause and notice, the different colored leaves, or grab a handful of them and have an invitation to make a circle with the leaves and to just chat about it as you're doing it, with this idea of experimentation and play.
I love it. And what I'm hearing when listening to your story is there's no downside here. It's only an upside, right? It's easy, it's accessible, it's what you already have. And it's just also, I feel like the way you're describing it, there's so much of the grown up can get from it as well. So the grown up then is focusing on how can I up level the child's experience, right? And so by doing that, it's up leveling their own experience too. It's helping them experience mindfulness. So you must share a story. We love stories. Have you got a success stories of maybe a student that you work with or someone in your community?
Yeah, so I'll actually one story that comes to mind often for me because it gave me goosebumps when I heard it, and then anytime I share it, it's actually a big part of why I started sharing mindful art for children and parents and teachers working with children. Because initially I only taught the exercises to adults, and all of the trainings were for adults. Because as you mentioned, it's super powerful and transformative for us as well. But
Mm.
I was teaching online. This was post COVID, right around the time when kiddos were starting to go back into schools. So, understandably, a lot of kiddos were having a hard time then. And I was teaching an online creativity retreat for adults, mostly women. It seemed to be the population, probably 90% were females, 35 to 55 online. And I was sharing a doodling practice with really simple watercolors where you notice the colors swirling on the page. And once it dries, then you go back in and you draw and doodle and pick out the shapes that you're seeing on the page. So it's almost like the opposite of a coloring book. And it's a very simple practice. And one of the women, people were sharing images of what they created. And a woman shared that she, at the time, had a 7-year-old son who was having a lot of tantrums. He was struggling with focusing in school. He was really having a hard time. And that she decided to show him what she made and gave him materials. And she said, when she posted the comment, it was a week in. So she said for that entire week, he would come home from school, and the first thing he would do would go up to his room, and how excited he was to do his own meditative doodling. And she
Mm.
said that he had less tantrums, he was sleeping better at night, he was focusing better in school. And what kind of gets me when I heard about it and when I repeat it is how excited he was to have something for himself, like that he could do
Oh,
that was his own. Um,
right.
so that was really a spark for me when I realized, oh, why am I only sharing this with adults? And that led me down
Mhm.
the path of doing more research with trauma informed practices and what happens with our brains and bodies and how to share in a responsible way. And so that was probably 5 years ago now that happened. Yeah.
Well, and what's so cool too is you've got my brain is like a popcorn thinking about these ideas, but what's interesting is quite novel. It's not, this isn't a practice that I hear a lot about. I've been doing this for a long time. So it's something interesting and different. And I can really see it working for neurodiverse children, like you mentioned, because, like for my kiddo, talk therapy is not her thing. And for a lot of children, it's not, it's hard to put what they're going through into words, right? And so, I've had success with my daughter when she's having big emotions, is give her a piece of paper and she can write it. But it's again taking that to the next level of you're actually engaging in art in a more deep and meaningful way. I think that's really special. I think you like you said, you're definitely onto something that's really cool, both at home and in the classrooms. I just love that. That's beautiful. So what advice do you have for, yoga teachers, educators, parents, all of us listening here who are looking to get started, right? But they have, there's that little voice in your mind, like I'm not artistic enough, or I don't have all the materials, or I don't have time, or I don't have I don't want to put anything more on my plate, all the things, right? So how do you recommend people just get started?
Yeah, it's so interesting you name those because those are some of the most common things I hear from students. Um,
Yeah.
and it's so the main thing that I would say is that what I love about mindful art practices is you can literally do them in 1 to 5 minutes. I think that very valid reason that can come up of feeling like I'm already overwhelmed, I'm already swamped, I can't add anything else onto my plate. I don't have the bandwidth to explore something new or bring something new into my, rituals or routines at home. It's very doable. And especially how much we spend on our screens. What I love about this practice is that it is very analog. You're working with paper, you're not looking at a screen. So even if you're doing just 5 minutes, it can help give that break. So I really
Mhm.
encourage routines, whether for yourself or with your kiddos. You're at home, you have, family dinner time, or you might have a ritual before bed that you can easily add on a 5 minute mindful art playtime together or exploration. And maybe it's just making marks with the breath or playing music, or maybe it's looking at different colors and feeling colored papers in your hands and talking about it together. Maybe it's following one of the in-depth practices that I share that you can do in 5 minutes. But having some sort of ritual or routine that you can come back to, even if it's once a week, is a great way to get started. And if you are a teacher and you're sharing in the classroom or you're sharing in yoga studios, that's also something that you can focus on. Okay, what can I do to bring just 2 minutes into the classroom that will give a
Mm.
little mindfulness break when I'm sharing with kiddos? And so that's what I would encourage to get started. I believe on my website as well, I have a resources page that have other books and articles. So people who like to read and have more information, you can always seek those sorts of things out as well. But the main thing is just keep it very simple and short and have that low barrier to entry. Mhm.
Yeah, I love that. And so could you say with your different age groups, could you say there was one particular activity that the younger children, like the elementary, really loved, and then maybe a teenage, and then maybe a grown up? Could you say maybe one for each of those groups, just so people can start to think, okay, how do I apply this to me right now? Like what's something I can do right after they listen to us?
Yeah, so I'll start adults and I'll work my way backwards. So,
Yeah.
one of the most common practices that I hear for adults, you mentioned earlier, kind of the challenge of maybe expressing ourselves verbally if something's coming up. And that was really my experience when I was being treated for cancer in my late 20s, is that I couldn't articulate a lot of what I was experiencing, but I knew I was feeling a lot. And so at that time, I started exploring a mindfulness and intuitive collage practice, which I would say is very popular with my adults because it does basically we're allowing the images to choose us. It's inspired by
Mm.
Sina Frost, who created Soul Collage, and we're allowing the images to choose us. And then there's a writing practice after you create the collage with specific prompts. And that writing practice really gets to the heart of what you're feeling in the moment, what your thoughts are,
Mm.
what your worries might be, what might feel like a solution or a support for yourself. So it's definitely more, it engages a lot more of our frontal lobe and our emotional centers. And so that's why it's more for adults than our kiddos. So
What kind of medium would you use for that one then?
yeah, so that one is largely done with magazine papers,
Okay. Yeah.
images that are already available. Although you can do that practice really with anything. The advantage of doing that with magazine papers is that the image is already out before you. So you can perhaps allow an image of, an ocean with a boat by itself out in the far off distance. That might have some meaning when you look at it compared to if we were to draw a squiggly line that represented an ocean. There's already a bit more depth to the visual imagery that's already created. So that's typically done with magazine papers.
And
And
again, Cynthia, that's another example of something that we've heard of before. How many of us have collage? I feel like when I started my business, that it was like creative business or something, and used to get together with my other friends who were heart-based business, and we used to always do collages. So it's something that is accessible. But what you're talking about, again, is that next level of, okay, feel, notice what images are you're drawn to, because that was always, like you said, it was I have a thought about how I want my business or my life to go, and I'm looking for the images. What you're talking about is going through and noticing how the images feel in your body and in your mind and your spirit, choosing those, and then taking that step further on looking at, and going inward and doing a writing process. That's so cool.
Yeah, exactly. It's a reverse again way of exploring if you imagine like vision boards. So oftentimes with
Yes.
that, we have the intention, we're looking for, a house with a white picket fence that we want to put on our board to then work towards. And instead, in this process, you're flipping through a magazine and maybe you notice, oh, interesting, that shed is drawing my attention, or there's this picture of this owl and I feel really curious about it for whatever reason. And we don't need to understand when we're choosing the images or allowing them to choose us. The kind of magic with that practice comes with the writing process. Um,
Mm.
so yeah, and then for teenagers, I find this is for adults as well, but with teenagers, I teach a mindful mandalas practice, which the starting point is similar to what things have probably heard of, drawing within a circle, drawing repetitive marks or patterns within that mandala. It tends to be looser. The traditional mandala drawings are very repetitive patterns. There's a bit more freedom with this approach. But once you have created your image, there's a 4-part writing process that focuses on what are you noticing with your thoughts, your emotions, what physical objects might you be seeing in the image, etc. And that one is very fun because it can offer really quick insights, and it's very accessible for teenagers, and adults also love it as well. And then for our younger kiddos, I tend to notice that practices that are much more viscerally based, body based, things that focus on the breath, or things with our hands that you can use larger crayons or focus on movement and color, that tends to, I mean, it's just developmentally, it's easier depending on the age group, because we're not diving deep into thoughts, although depending on the age, it would vary slightly. But those are kind of the go-tos that I tend to notice for younger ages, and can be a really wonderful way to also have space to have popcorn. They're mentioning, oh, I noticed this color, or I notice this particular, wind or rustle from the tree, or I'm really drawn to this stick, and I want to place it next to this one. And there's a lot of permission and agency for the kiddo to choose and make the marks or shapes that they feel drawn to. And I joke, but it's very serious, that I started painting happy trees with Bob Ross in my late 20s when I was struggling with anxiety. And I joke that he is one of the original mindful artists because he gives so much permission to create your own world. And I find that for our young kiddos, especially when they're playing with sensory play and breath and objects, that it's really just this huge permission for them to make their own world, and the encouragement around that.
Yes. And I have to say, I do, the reality is our curriculum in arts in elementary schools and preschools is very technical, which is great. I'm sure it's not how I grew up or how I taught, but I'm sure there's some advantage to that, no doubt. Absolutely. So there's a reason for that. But I remember when my daughter was little, specifically looking for art studios outside privately so she could have more of an open-ended exploration. So yes, I definitely think there's, and in the classroom too, that, because it's, even though it's not art in an elementary classroom, but absolutely we can add it into morning meeting or after break or in quiet time or wherever. And so going back to what you were saying about these 3 different exercises, the thing that just keeps coming back for me is, for those of us listening, the curiosity, if you're curious about it, like, where do I start? And I can see so much value in trying it as a grown up, whether it's by yourself, getting your friends together, getting your colleagues together, doing it, just in your neighborhood or in a community center or at a professional development in your schools, just sharing it, because it's that infusion of excitement and novelty and having those miracle moments, like you talked about, magic, having that magic experience that is naturally going to come through. Your enthusiasm is going to come through when you bring these practices to children, right? And so I imagine with your teacher training, no doubt you're starting with the adults first, right? Having them have the experience and then secondary, bring it to the children. Would you agree?
Absolutely. Yeah. In all of our teacher trainings, I say again and again that we teach from our practice first. And the more that we become comfortable and familiar with these different mindful art activities, the more that we can then support other adults or children because we've had a lived experience of what challenges might come up, what we really appreciate or notice, what curiosities are in there. And so we're able to be more present for other adults or children. And I feel like others can tell when we're infectiously joyful around a practice, and that
Yes.
can also be infused when we're sharing it out with adults or children. That there's this level of resonance and excitement with a practice that we've experienced ourselves that we're excited to then share with someone else. Mhm.
Yeah. Oh, Cynthia, thank you so much for spending this time. Honestly, I am so inspired. I want to get off this call and go and do something. Look at how else I can, bring art into my day as well, and with my child. So thank you so much. You've been so generous with your energy. You can just tell you're living your passion, you're living your karma, your dharma, your work is meant to be. So I so appreciate you. How can our community find you online? And what's up? What are you up to next? What's happening?
Yeah, the easiest way to learn more from me, as well as have some mindful art activities that you can dive into right away, would be to download the free workbook. I think it has 5 or 6 mindful art activities for both adults and how you can share them with kiddos in your lives. So that would be my number one recommendation. I'll share the link with you. And then right now, we're currently really focusing on training 1,000 teachers. We're at about 400. I used to, in the past, I would teach workshops and retreats directly only, and then I realized once I took other trainings and I was being taught the practices, but not how to teach, how to create lesson plans, how to then share it out in the world in a trauma informed way. I became really passionate about that, and so I love the phrase "a candle loses nothing by lighting another flame." And so my hope is to train more teachers because then we can share it with more people, adults and kiddos. So that's really my focus right now. Yeah.
Beautiful. Well, keep it on. Your work is amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
So appreciate you. Thank you.